And so what I try to do is, if I'm looking at Africa, I'm trying to look at or use work by Africans.
Of course, for people of African descent, it becomes primarily more important again, because we understand that we are in a game. This game that we are playing, it is important that we know a bit about the rule. To know the rule, we need to know where we are coming from. And of course, this takes us back again to the story and the history and what has been before us. I remember one time I was interviewing a US historian, and he was telling me that when I want to tell my son about history, because of course I was telling him, hey, define for me, what do you mean by history? And he was telling me, well, I would tell my grandson that my grandpa came before me, so I come before you. So for you to know who you are, you're going to have to learn about me. Now you are learning about me, you are learning about you. So it's a web that is very complicated sometimes, but it's absolutely important. We must understand that by learning about history, we're actually learning about us. Because if we don't know our history, therefore we don't know where we are coming from, then we are lost. And when we are lost, a lot of danger that await us, because with them we can even be at a danger to ourselves. It looks like someone who is having a nuclear bomb, and you don't know the consequence of what you are holding. So it means you can make it explode anytime because you don't know what you are holding, no? Anyway, let me put the question like this so that we can sort of zero it down a bit. Which area are you concentrating on in African studies? Sort of take us down to a line that you are focusing on mainly.
Couple interests, I think. So I guess I can kind of start with kind of what my dissertation topic was and how I'm kind of really expanding on that, and then kind of some emerging things that I'm interested in. So I guess I'll say, like, so at Temple, for my dissertation topic, I did an Afrocentric analysis of the philosophies of Howard Thurman. So if you're not sure who Howard Thurman was, he was a theologian, philosopher, mystic, and a kind of just really this prominent figure in the civil rights movement in terms of how he influenced Martin Luther King and James Farmer, and pretty much the entirety of the early civil rights movement with his whole ideas of nonviolent activism. So kind of with that, and just kind of expanding on what I'm looking at now, I really am interested on this idea of intellectual activism, intellectual histories. So it's kind of where I'm focusing at now, but what I'm doing now is just kind of looking at also the ways in which women have contributed to that. So just kind of some current research that I'm looking at Dr. Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, who was the second African American woman to get a PhD and the first African American woman to earn a PhD from UPenn, and also the first African American woman to get a law degree from UPenn. And so she, similar to Thurman, was really involved in the civil rights movement. She worked on President Harry Truman's commission to secure these rights. And so the areas that I'm really looking at right now is this whole idea of intellectual activism, intellectual history, how figures such as Thurman and Alexander really used their intellect, their voice, in order to kind of speak out against the injustices facing African American people, then also to provide solutions.
I'll keep that in mind. Now, when you say African studies, are you looking at African diaspora or looking at African in general sense? In this sense, you're looking at African in Africa. Can you sort of help me understand that part?
So when I say Africana studies, so Africana studies as a whole really encompasses the whole diaspora. For my specific research, I tend to focus more on African American studies. I think it's important to note that you really can't look at African American studies without looking at the diaspora and looking at the continent. So just kind of going back to my dissertation and looking at this whole idea of analyzing Howard Thurman's work Afrocentrically, I pulled in ethical concepts such as which is ancient Kemetic ethics. And so while I really tend to focus on elements of African American studies, I do have these elements of African studies or African elements, because you really can't properly look at African American studies, in my opinion, without examining Africa, because it all ties back to Africa in some sense.
All right. That is interesting now. Now, how do you examine Africa? Okay, now, all right. You see, the other day I was doing an interview relating to, I think it was Web Du Bois. Okay, we talk of Marco Garvey. Then, of course, we talk also another important personality of African descent. They were talking about African study. Now, we were saying, but who is teaching Africans about Africa? What material are we using? Because then it becomes very interesting, because now we see Web Du Bois, we see the evolution of him as a person, the kind of opinion that he was having when he was much younger, a younger scholar, and the opinion that they have when he became more mature, and of course in his later years. We can see how people grow, no? So it becomes very interesting for me in those areas, in trying to understand what material are we using to study our history. So in this sense, I'm trying to ask you, when you want to understand Africa as a member of African diaspora, because you understand that your ancestry are coming from Africa, so you don't have any doubt about that. But when you want to talk to your students, when you want to analyze these stories, this trajectory, what material do you use?
So yeah, that's a great question. So what I like to use, so for example, I guess I can give an example. So I'm working on some work on Africana womanism, and then also kind of pulling into the discussion just this work from African women. And so what I try to do is, if I'm looking at Africa, I'm trying to look at or use work by African scholars. So looking at some of the ways in which elements of African womanism may be present in the works of African female writers, for example. When I looked at looking at Thurman in terms of Afrocentricity and pulling in Ma'at, actually getting texts that are focused really in Africa. So I guess to answer that question, what I'm really wanting to look at is, if I'm examining Africa, I try to get African sources, because if we kind of know the history, a lot of what's been put out about Africa has been Eurocentric sources, and it's been biased. And so I think it's important, if you're looking at Africa, to do so from African sources as much as possible.
All right. I don't know how much you want to go in that, but also it also depends on how much we want to go. I don't know how much we really want to go about Africa in trying to understand the history of Africa, because you just said before in your previous explanation that African, of course, we are looking at the birthplace of humanity, which means that we are not going to be able to see the beginning of our history as a people. We can see the beginning of European history, for example. We can see the beginning of Chinese history. We can see the beginning of or maybe ancient American history, but we cannot see the beginning of African history, because that is the birthplace of humanity. It has been there before our timeline. Okay.